we have Dr. Richard Damania, who is the chief economist of the Sustainable Development Practice Group at the World Bank. Richard and I kind of started in the bank around the same time, and we worked in Pakistan about 20 years ago. So we have some very fond memories on Pakistan agriculture. I think I'll just very quickly introduce Richard, and then we'll get started. And then as we go over each discussants, I'll make some mention. But let me actually say, apart from Richard, we have Kavita Rao and we have Siddharth Goel. So Kavita is the director in IPFP and Siddharth is the senior policy advisor at IAST. And we are delighted to have all of you here. And we also have a special mention, Professor Ashok Gulati, who is our distinguished professor at NICREER, who is also joined. So we'll hear from each of you a little bit, and then we'll have more Q&A. So to explain you a little bit more, and I won't get into the substance of the issues which we'll cover, but just to give you a bit of a brief introduction to Richard. Richard has had several positions in the World Bank, including the senior economic advisor in the water practice, lead economist in Africa's Sustainable Development Department, South Asian, Latin America, and Caribbean regions. I think you also worked in India and produced a very interesting report on India's development with Rinku Murgai and Land Pritchett. Is that correct? Yeah. Prior to joining the bank, Richard was a professor of economics at the University of Adelaide. He's published extensively with various economic journals, has held numerous advisory positions in the government and international organization, and serves in the editorial board of several prestigious journals. And since I haven't really read the report much, I won't talk about it, but I think one of the things, this topic is of real interest in India, the current purpose, for some of the same reason that the report mentions. You know, some of the size of our subsidies are fairly significant. Some would say even macro critical in terms of how much they could influence your fiscal trajectory. And at the same time, there is this increasing importance of looking at climate change, and the whole dialogue on climate change has completely changed in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And there's a lot of hunger for these ideas about how do we repurpose existing subsidies to make them much more resilient, for a more resilient economy and for climate change. So I think it's a terrific topic, something of interest. And so with that, Richard, Mike is yours.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you, Deepak, firstly, for being such a wonderful host and agreeing to host this seminar. And it's certainly an honor to be here and to be among such incredible experts and some who are really legends in the field. So most grateful for this. Can I start, just click on the PowerPoint? Yeah. Hopefully you can see it. Okay. So this is a report on subsidies, and our focus is going to be global. We do have India results, but I won't talk too much about the India results because, as you will know, when you start talking about country-specific results, you need to go through lots of clearances, et cetera, in the position that I'm in. But I can give you hints about where we are at on the India results and what's actually happening over there. Oops, why is this moving on so? Okay. All right. The issue of subsidies in natural resource sectors is a really old one. In fact, none less than the father of economics, Adam Smith, wrote about it and worried about it. And he argued that it has, I'm afraid, been too common for too long for fishing vessels to go after the subsidy rather than going after the fish and trying to catch fish. So you might think if something's been around for hundreds of years, we have nothing useful to really say. Hopefully, I will be able to convince you that we can give a new twist to this old problem and also give you a sense with some new research and new data of the magnitude of the problem and what it entails. We're going to look at subsidies in natural resource sectors. We're going to look at 3 critical natural assets related to air, land, and oceans. Without them, we cannot survive. So for air, it will be fossil fuels. For land, we will focus almost exclusively on agriculture, and oceans will focus mainly on fish. We'll also look at 3 outcomes. We'll be interested in efficiency, and most of the time we'll go after something called TFP, which stands for Total Factor Productivity. Then we are worried about the environmental impacts, because remember, these are natural resources. And of course, at the heart of everything that we do, we also have to worry about equity or the distributional impact of these subsidies. This is a big topic, it's a big ask. What's the broad approach that we actually use? Almost everything, till I tell you otherwise, that we're going to say or do is based on empirical work on econometric analysis, one notable exception, one or two notable exceptions that I will point out. If this were an academic seminar, this would be the product of about 6 papers, but we're going to compile all of that, condense all of that into about a 20-minute talk. The way we go after the things, the questions, the research questions that we want to ask, is we look at country level data. And we first start with a country that has the best data and try to explore what's happening. Then try to zoom out to global data sets. Of course, the data sets globally are never as good as the ones that you have for the individual countries. And then check, is what you're coming up with consistent with the literature? Sometimes it all moves in the same direction. In other times, when we get to some of the climate change related issues, I will point out it doesn't. And then there are contradictory answers in terms of what we get and what the literature says. And I'll be very clear about that. Okay, let's start by the most obvious question. Globally, what is the magnitude of subsidies that we see in air for agriculture and fisheries? Explicit subsidies, think of this as, say, the amount of money the government is handing over to the sectors, come to roughly about $1 trillion. This is a very, very approximate figure. Roughly just under 50% is fossil fuel based, roughly under 50% is agriculture, and a smaller amount for fisheries. But even this number is rubbery and likely to be an underestimate. Why is it an underestimate? Because very many low-income countries are not doing their accounting very well. As Professor Gulati said, even in a country with such good accounting as India, it's very hard to track where the subsidies have actually been going. A third reason is a genuine one, is where do you draw the line? The government has a road going to your farm or your factory. Is that a subsidy or is that a public good? You know, where does one actually say the subsidy begins and the public good ends? That's the explicit subsidy. Even that is hard to do. Implicit subsidy, it's a term that was used most famously by the IMF, is the damage that's done. And we're just giving you over there in that $6 trillion figure, the estimate that comes from the literature, not ours necessarily. Whichever way you want to cut it, that's a large amount of money that's hidden or being squirreled away, and therefore not being spent on things that we all unambiguously want and like education, like health, and other things that we need, like transport services. Okay. Let's now start with land. When we talk about land, we'll begin with agriculture. The numbers that you're going to see here are not numbers we come up with, they're numbers from the literature, right? Because so many people have been trying to do the accounting, we didn't think in our small team we could really contribute. But when you put it all together and you look at the magnitude and the distribution of subsidies across countries, there's a couple of things, maybe 3 things to pick up from this. One is the outsized role of China that we actually have. The second thing generally that you will see, but not perfectly, of course, is the bigger the economy, the bigger is the subsidy. Then there is this funny thing that we see with India. This is not us, by the way, this is OECD and FAO. It tells you there's a negative subsidy. And what they're arguing over there is that there is a threshold price, an international threshold price. And if the price I give my farmers is less than that threshold price, regarded as a negative subsidy. We'll come to that in a minute. Perhaps another way, an easier way to look at this, rather than the different categories that OECD have for the different subsidies, is to just look at subsidies that are coupled, tied to production or inputs or output, and subsidies that are uncoupled, untied to inputs or outputs. And this is actually quite interesting because what we see is that high-income countries, most are uncoupled or untied, or more, if not most, are uncoupled or untied. Whereas when we go to the more developing countries and the poorer the country, the more and more you get tied to either input or to output. Very quickly, if you want to look at India, because we're here in India, and again, I emphasize I don't necessarily believe these numbers, they come from OECD, you see the sort of the level of the subsidy, and you take away that blue line, which is the negative, based on the threshold, then you get a sense of where the subsidies really are. They're non-trivial, but they're not absolutely massive. And now let's look.
Where is the oil price subsidy going?
So this is
This is
based,
land.
sorry,
This is the, where does the oil price subsidy show
this
up?
is land.
This is land.
Land,
Okay.
sorry,
Yeah.
this is land. Okay. Okay, so now let's begin to look at the impacts systematically. And if you ask yourself this basic question is, if you were to start from the very beginning and you look at your agricultural policy, even your subsidy regime, what would be the one or two or three or four things you would ask of your subsidy regime? Thing number one you would ask is that it enhances efficiency and productivity. As an economist, we would say it maximizes or tries to maximize TFP, total factor productivity. What do we actually see across the world? What we see is that generally what subsidies tend to do in all the analyses that we have, is this is the brown, if you like, right at the bottom, they certainly increase output, but they almost always empirically lower efficiency. And this holds when we do global analysis using stochastic frontier analysis. It holds when we do more detailed country level analysis. And it also comes out from a very large meta-analysis that we do, which is, if you like, a statistical review of the literature. This is the one result which consistently comes out. In other words, what's the intuition here? Is that, yeah, if I give you free water, irrigation water, of course your output will go up. But because that water is free, I'm going to waste that water, right? So efficiency goes down. It's not just the subsidy, it's the design of the subsidy which matters. What we find is that the worst kind of subsidizing is through inputs: free water, free fertilizer, subsidized water, subsidized fertilizer. The next best seems to be output-based support. So if, for example, I'm subsidizing wheat instead of rice, I will shift my production from rice to wheat, hypothetically, but at least the input combination is not distorted as it would be with an input subsidy. I'm talking about microeconomics 101, right? That's what the model will tell you. That's what the results seem to tell us as well. The best as well is uncoupled subsidies, that is untied to what I produce. This is exactly what you would expect. Second question we'd ask ourselves, think of an ideal agricultural policy. You would want the policy to be kind to water, because without water I can produce nothing, and to be kind also to the land on which I produce. So how kind to water or land are the subsidies that we see? Before we answer that question, we need to take a detour. And of course, in some of this, Professor Gulati's work is very, very relevant. And we're going to talk about nitrogen fertilizers. And we're going to start our story of nitrogen right at the beginning in 1905. In 1905, two really brilliant German scientists, Karl Bosch and Fritz Haber, came up with an invention which the Nobel Committee, which gave them the Nobel Prize, called the greatest geoengineering feat in history. They discovered a way to take nitrogen from the air and synthetically turn it into ammonia, which when we apply to the soil, gives fertility to the soil. And that, without doubt, has enabled the billions of people that we see today alive. In my very humble opinion, and I'm but a humble, simple economist, I cannot see how you could produce as much food that we have today without the inorganic fertilizer that Professors Bosch and Haber actually gave us. And therefore, it should be no surprise to you that fertilizer use across the world has gone through the roof and continues to go through the roof, except with that blue slither called Africa right at the bottom. But even that is going through the roof, I assure you. But look at Asia, which is us here as well as China. We account for a massive proportion of the nitrogen that's used. India and China overwhelm anyone else put together. There's an if and there's a but. You use so much fertilizer, most of it is free or very, very cheap. You're going to use it wastefully. So this is based on, I can show you the equation later on, but let's tell the story and we'll get to the econometrics later on. This is showing you what the productivity or if you like, the marginal returns, the marginal yield that you get from increased fertilizer in different regions. I'm afraid you can't see the numbers, I'm very sorry. But if you look at the extreme right, where you're on the downward sloping proportion of the response function, that is the median level of East Asia. In East Asia, we're using so much fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, every additional unit is not doing good. In South Asia, we're right at the peak, which means 50% of South Asia is using too much. And 50% is using too little. Dare I say this, I would imagine somewhere like Bihar would probably be on the left, and other states would probably be on the right. But Professor Gulati would probably correct me there. I haven't looked at those numbers very closely, but I can find out for you. What happens to the nitrogen that gets wasted? Globally, on average, this is a global average figure, 40% of nitrogen that we apply to the soil gets absorbed by the crop and remains in the soil. The remaining 60%, some of it will go into the water, and when it goes into the water, it can be very toxic. It's so toxic that when babies consume water with high levels of nitrogen, they get something called blue baby syndrome, which is fatal to babies. And we've seen a spike in blue baby syndrome, for example. There's a good JDE paper in India after the Green Revolution. Those children that actually survive the blue baby syndrome will end up being stunted. In India, the number ends up being that you lose roughly 50, if you're exposed and have a 3-year cumulative exposure to nitrogen, roughly you lose 50% of the gain in height due to excessive nitrogen exposure. And we know that stunting is a very, very good marker of development. Not nice. The subsidies, and you'll see a graph very soon, will account for roughly 17% globally of this excess nitrogen that you see. What happens to the nitrogen that's neither in the soil nor in the water? It gets volatilized as nitrous oxide into the air. And nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than is CO2 carbon dioxide. Not good. Which is why some scientists like Bonnie Keeler from the University of Minnesota, I mentioned that because someone over here is going there, I hear very soon. She calls nitrogen the biggest global externality, larger even than carbon, because of this harm that it's doing to human health. I didn't even talk about the cancer stuff. I'm writing a paper for the Lancet on that. You want to see what the impact of subsidies is? Here you have it. I just ask you to focus on the green bit where it says decoupled. What we see is when we have decoupled subsidies, the impact on pollution is 0. Otherwise, there is some positive impact. You can add those numbers up, split it the way we economists do. Conclusion, the subsidies are not kind to water. Deforestation is a very big problem. If I had my PowerPoint here, this would be animated, and you'd see over 10 years, the increase in the red, which is the deforestation in a cell. Deforestation is not in decline. It's increasing. It's fine when that happens in production forests, forests that are used for producing timber, paper, and so on. It's not fine when it happens in conservation forests, like Northeast India, like the Congo, like the Amazon, and so on. Have the Western Ghats, the Eastern Ghats. It's not good when it happens there. We know that agriculture is the biggest driver of deforestation. And in particular, commercial agriculture accounts for 70% of global forest loss. 20% is due to, if you like, subsistence, shifting agriculture, and 10% really the rest. Commercially, it's cattle, palm oil, soil, cereal, and timber. So we focus on those 5 crops. We do a lot of it's very difficult. Actually, we work with someone from Stanford. We come up with and we find that the subsidies account for 14% of deforestation annually. There's a lot of heterogeneity, which means there's a lot of variability. But one key source of heterogeneity is how powerful is the subsidy in destroying the forest, depends on how far away you are from the forest frontier. If you look at this map of the Amazon, the darker is the green, the closer you are to the forest. So dark green, you're under 2 kilometers, 1 to 2 kilometers from the forest. We should be very worried as to how close The farms are to the forest frontier, given the very high elasticity that you have of deforestation next to the frontier. So not just that if Brazil were to offer subsidies, it causes deforestation. We also have cross-border impacts that we can causally trace. So when beef subsidies spike in the United States, you get increases in deforestation in Brazil. Likewise, if there's a demand for soy, which is driven by something or the other, perhaps feeding pigs in China, you will see spikes occurring elsewhere. The very, very big cross-border impacts that are caused that need to be tracked, traced, and exposed because of what they do. Clearly not kind to land either. So then we might turn around and say, okay, at least the poor are being helped. So at least the subsidies are progressive. This is the weakest part of the report because we couldn't get very good data across all countries. For the data that we could get, it's a complex issue, is what we seem to find is that subsidies, input subsidies, are generally regressive. Why are input subsidies regressive? If you're a big farmer, you're typically a richer farmer, you use more nitrogen, you use more inputs, you get more subsidy. If you're a poor farmer, you've got a smaller farm, you use less. There's a but and there's a however. Even if I'm poor and I'm very small, and if I get less, that subsidy that I receive in the countries we looked at are a higher proportion of my income as a poor person than the income of the richer farmer. So relatively, it's still very, very, very important for me in all the countries that we looked at. We couldn't get good enough data for output subsidies because, of course, it depends on the way it's done, the minimum support price, etc. But you can tell spatially where the subsidies are spent. And here we see some tendency towards subsidies being spatially progressive in the sense in which output subsidies tend to accrue to the regions that are poorer in general, and this is global. But there's variation between, say, the countries in red and the countries that you see in blue. Okay, let's move now very quickly. I spent too much time on the land issue. Let's go to air. Everyone's worried about air pollution and air issues. So let's start talking about fossil fuel subsidies globally. About $500 billion. That's twice as large as the global subsidies accruing to renewable energy. That's 5 times larger than global promises to fight climate change. So that's not good. Who are the biggest payers of subsidies? Once again, large economies dominate, but not exclusively. This time you will see that if you're a large producer of fossil fuels, in a strange paradoxical way, you seem to be a large subsidizer of fossil fuels as well. Notice India does show up over there, even though it's not a large producer of fossil fuels in the grand scheme of things. If we look at South Asian countries, you look at absolute explicit subsidies, which I'm going to suggest to you is misleading, you will see that the subsidy follows the size of the economy, which is not telling you very much, right? If I'm on a giant economy, you know what? I could have a very small subsidy, it's going to look large. A better way to look at it might be subsidy intensity of energy. So how much are you paying per unit of energy consumed? Now we see a lot of interesting variation. I'm not saying it's causal, but it probably is causal, that a lot of the countries which are peaking over there have also got enormous debt problems. And a lot of the IMF reforms that are being proposed are proposed for the energy subsidies being paid. And it's, of course, very, very hard. And you see that actually in this chart over here as well. Not all, but some of them. Okay, what do the subsidies look like? We know that the subsidies on fossil fuels, the use of fossil fuels, is going to cause air pollution like the smog that we see outside in Delhi. The World Health Organization categorizes hazardous pollution more than 35 micrograms. We are way above 35 micrograms here. And unsafe, which is 5 micrograms. If we look at the countries with the greatest number of people exposed, we see India and China at the top. The numbers over there are percentages. But there is a very, very big difference in India, and I'll show you next all of South Asia. Almost everywhere in the country, we're exposed to hazardous levels of pollution, right? Whereas China, it's roughly 50-50. If you look at it between the blue and the orange.
Need a different category, like higher than 100.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
35 is.
35 is clean, right?
It doesn't.
35 is when you go to Shimla, right? To breathe in the fresh air. Okay. Then you look at the countries with the largest proportion share of population exposed. Really no surprise that you're seeing South Asia dominating the scene over here. But what is really, really surprising is look further down. Who on earth expected to see countries such as you've got there in Africa? And I'm going to come to that issue again.
How do you say Singapore?
Yes, Singapore.
That's Indonesia, right?
It's a Malaysia-Indonesia effect. I think blown across, right? And there's a lot, I mean, actually a lot of the smog in India, as you know, around here has been blown across the border as well. And it keeps going.
That's the current narrative.
But it keeps going, right? It's built as well, it keeps going. Okay, maybe we kind of looked at this and you kind of know this. This is what these graphs are saying, particularly if you look at the one on the right again. For all of South Asia, you've got the same problem. It's hazardous, it's over 35 micrograms. Nowhere else, no other region are we seeing that. So we can't just blame outsiders, right? That's something that's happening over here. But I'm not going to emphasize that point too much. What I want to move to now is a different study that was done that I think was quite unique. What we did was we identified all of the coal-fired power stations that were built. And one thing that you will see in all of those dots is the coal-fired power stations are broadly in rich countries and in rich regions in rich countries. And that should come as no surprise because we can have no growth without power. And coal, whether we like it or not, is a cheap form of power. That's the reality that we actually confront. So what we did is we worked with people at the University of Columbia to empirically measure and work out the amount of smoke or pollution coming out of all of these coal-fired power stations and where it actually blows. And can you identify any country from the smoke plumes?
India, China,
Yeah.
Indonesia.
You were reading, cheating. Isn't it clear? Isn't it crystal clear?
Yeah.
Right?
They're
Okay.
the first two.
So what we actually do from the analysis is that we look at where the smoke is coming out of the chimney. Then you actually examine where the wind is blowing it. And there's some really, really sophisticated equations that come into play. And then you work out that smoke plume. So you can then work out what is the GDP at the source, what is the GDP upwind, and what is the GDP downwind, because you have now very, very good spatial GDP data done by Kumu et al. And here's the summary of the results that we actually find. Globally, about 2 billion people are affected by this pollution that they face. What you tend to find is that the downwind areas, of course, are much more polluted. But you also find the downwind areas are systematically poorer. So you've got coal as you need it to actually grow the economy, then you've got the smoke coming in the downwind areas. In every country that we look at, those downwind areas are poorer. There's two explanations for that, and the next study that we're doing is going to tease this. What is a causal process? It could be what's called sorting, or it could be siting. So sorting is that the pollution is blowing, I'm very poor, housing is cheaper, I go and stay there. That's sorting, we sort by income. It could also be siting, that the coal-fired power station goes to where the costs are the lowest. And the costs seem to be lowest where there's poor people because land prices are low, et cetera, et cetera. So is it sorting or is it siting? So this next study that we're doing is going to tease that out, where we can't answer that. We have to remain agnostic on that issue. Then one of the other things that we do, I'm going to end very quickly over here, is a meta-analysis, 400 studies, 2,000 estimates, to work out what is the elasticity of demand of fossil fuel usage with respect to prices. And you systematically find demand is very inelastic, unresponsive to fossil fuel prices. In the short run, a 10% increase in energy price will only lead to a 2% decline in consumption. The intuition is very, very obvious, because if I don't have an alternative, you can triple the price of gasoline, I still have to drive my car if there's no public transport. In the long run, you get greater elasticity. These are all of the studies and the meta-analysis by energy type. The blue line that you see is a short-run elasticity. The orange line is a long-run elasticity. Orange line, the long-run estimates are always more rubbery than are the short-run estimates. Harder to calculate the long-run elasticity. Systematically, you see demand is not very elastic. And that tells us something, in terms of using prices as an instrument. You can try to do simulations to see if I remove the subsidies, what's going to happen to the pollution. In some places, not very much, 2%, it'll fall. Some places, 40%, it'll fall. In other words, you need some complementary measures, as we were discussing earlier. We'll come to that. What can we say about the distributional impact? I think we should be very cautious on these results. Our results using some World Bank data tell us that most of the benefits, if you got rid of the subsidies, would accrue to the poorer people because they consume less fossil fuel intensive goods. There are other studies, such as the one published by Krantz et al. In the Review of Economic Studies, which show a very different answer. So again, I think this is work in progress that deserves a lot more research. Shall I skip fisheries? It up, okay. If anyone wants me to talk about fisheries, I can very quickly, but I think it's been
What do you say, Ashok, do you want to talk about fisheries?
What's your time frame?
I mean, we have 3 discussants, 4 to 5 minutes each. I'm including you as a discussant here, and then Q&A. So
Yep.
we can go another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes. Okay, so another 5 minutes. Let me tell you this. I'll just speak 2 minutes on fisheries. Talk about fisheries subsidies. Again, there's an outsized subsidizer, China. The other thing that you would notice is that most of the subsidies are in the east, or countries located in the east and the South China Sea, right? So what we do is we work with another university to try to work out in the South China and East China Sea, what is the impact of subsidies? And then just as an aside, because for development reasons, Mauritania is very important. Why is Mauritania important for the World Bank? It doesn't have a very big fishing fleet, but it sells its fish, while the people just illegally fish there. So what's it doing there? I'm not going to talk about that too much. When you talk about fisheries, you need to worry about 2 things. The first thing you need to worry about is that the fish are an open access resource. That means anyone there can go and fish. And if I don't go and fish today, you will go and fish and I'll lose that fish. Therefore, I have to fish, you have to fish, and Tom, Dick, and Harry has to fish. That's the open access tragedy of the commons. It's made worse by these vast subsidies that we have. In fact, so bad that when you get rid of the subsidies as a simulation, nothing happens to the fishery in the South and East China Sea. It's being so badly depleted, right? You have to have proper management of closing the fishery for any improvement to be seen. Not so bad elsewhere, but that's the point that I want to make. It's a complementary policy sometimes. Subsidies is not a cure-all. Getting rid of subsidies is not a cure-all for everything that you see. Okay, subsidies are so bad. Why have they been around for so long? Everyone knows that. Professor Gulati has been writing about this, and yet they persist. We've been writing about it, and I promise you they will persist. Why? I think there's 2 reasons. If you look at the sort of political economy of it. The first reason is that if I cut the subsidy, very often the benefit will be in the future, especially the environmental benefits in terms of pollution, etc. And they're not even that visible when they actually occur, those benefits. The second reason, when you cut the subsidies, someone's going to lose. And whoever's going to lose is going to lobby and fight a lot harder than the person who's going to get some hypothetical gain in the future. Your health is going to improve in the future, you don't know how much. Whereas if I'm going to lose my livelihood by the reduction of the subsidy, I'm going to fight really, really hard. And that asymmetry in lobbying, I think, creates resistance. So what we did was we looked at every single case that we could find of successful subsidy reform, and the millions, if not millions, the many more cases of unsuccessful subsidy reform, where you try to do something and people protest, or you try to do something and you reverse. And we come up with 5 principles for the success. What were the common elements of success and the common elements of failure where one of these 5 criterion were breached? The first is the credibility gap. That I promise that I'm going to remove subsidies and do something else, like I'm going to remove these public markets for, say, X agriculture, and all is going to be well. Maybe farmers don't believe you. There's a credibility issue. I'm going to remove the subsidy, but I'm going to compensate you with X. Maybe they don't believe you because I cannot tie the hands of the future government, right? This is time and consistency problem, as economists would say. Secondly, we've seen that you need complementary measures. Removing the subsidy alone will often not solve the problem. Thirdly, you should always worry about the distributional effects, because if you don't worry about distribution, there's going to be so much of a backlash, it's not going to survive. The next government is going to come in and reverse everything that you did. You do the change in a big step, in one big hit, forget it. Big protest, big hit. Small steps, gradual will get you there. And reinvest the revenues in ways that are actually visible. These seem, thank you so much. These seem such commonsensical principles, but they're observed in the breach. You do that, and subsidy reform might just be successful. With that, I thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was wonderful. It was not just informative, but you were very persuasive as well. I think, in a sense, it's a bit like too good to be true that, removing subsidy can be fiscally good, environmentally good, and economically good. So I think we have three discussants who would hopefully focus on these three. So I'm expecting Kavita to talk more on the fiscal side, Siddharth on the environmental side, and Dr. Gulati on the overall economy. So let me first turn to Kavita. Dr. Kavita Rao is the director of NIPFP New Delhi. She received a PhD in economics from ISI Kolkata and her master's in economics from DSC. Her research interest includes design and implementation of GST in India, goods and service tax, methodology for assessing the comprehensive impact of various tax exemptions on the economy, sectoral linkages and their implications in planning growth strategy. Over to you, Kavita, about 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Very interesting paper. This is, I think, an issue which the country continues to grapple with in many different ways. I think if you're looking at Karnataka elections, if you're looking at the entire discussion in the run-up to all elections in the country, we are talking about subsidies, but we are also talking about welfare payments. And the two together, we are trying to find a way to deliver benefits to the poorest of the poor, and at the same time develop and evolve a development strategy. And so my two key takeaways from your study, which I think were critical for my understanding, is one is slightly problematic and the other is interesting. The problematic one is where you highlight the fact that the interventions and the consequences are not localized. And therefore, the decisions that individual governments take are by themselves not adequate to mitigate the problems that you face in a country or otherwise. And so the need for a larger amount of international coordination among countries, international public institutions, so to say, to manage global public goods is becoming a bigger part of the narrative, or needs to be a bigger part of the narrative. The second issue that I found very interesting is the point about elasticities of price elasticities of fossil fuel consumption not being very high. That sort of raises the question of how much of the driver of consumption is actually subsidies and how much is economic activity per se. And if we can't disentangle the two, we have a challenge in trying to understand how governments should be pushing economic, strategizing economic development. So that while those are the two interesting takeaways for me, they also raise a few questions. In terms of questions, I have, I think, two questions, and I will be brief about them. The first question is, since we are talking about subsidies, in the context of air, land, and fisheries being toxic and disruptive. If we were to choose between alternative instruments of providing support to citizens, would you look at subsidies, which is production related, or would you look at welfare measures, which are direct transfers? So is it correct to focus on the consumer as the primary agent in the economy you would like to support, or is it the producer in the economy? And I think that is a question that we should be looking to answer in some coherent way going forward. The second question is when we talk about benefits to or a reform being progressive or regressive, it still doesn't mitigate from the fact that the poor household pays a cost. And just because it's progressive doesn't make it more acceptable. So a combination of some kind of direct benefit transfers would that be the route to mitigate? So in other words, the question I'm trying to ask is, do we find ways of getting people to produce more? Or do we content ourselves with supporting the consumer? As a fiscal economist, I think, what are you going to tell a government to do? Do nothing is never an option. So I'll stop it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kavita. Okay, so to this, so that invite Siddharth to join us. Let me introduce our second discussant, Siddharth Kaul, is Senior Policy Advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IIST. His experience and expertise lies in the field environment, energy, and sustainable transport, focused on policy analysis, project management, and communication. You want to say MPA degree from Columbia University with a specialization in global energy management policy. His recent work focuses on decentralized renewable energy, electric vehicles, and the role of state-owned enterprises in energy transition. Siddharth, 5 minutes, over to you.
So thank you so much, Mr. Mishra, and thank you for the wonderful presentation, Mr. Dalmia. I'll try to be brief, but in case I cross 5 minutes, please do cut me off. I think I have a lot of comments, questions, and things I want to share. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are with ISD, but we do a bottom-up assessment on an annual basis of fossil fuel and clean energy subsidies in India, South Africa, and Indonesia. We've been doing it for India over the last almost 6 years. So a lot of the findings definitely resonate with us. I think I won't touch upon some of sort of the points about subsidies being harmful because they're fairly well known. But I think I'll touch upon what we can basically learn from almost 15 years of attempts to reform distorting sort of energy subsidies. I think the first point is that transparency and impact evaluation of subsidies are really important, but they clearly aren't sufficient by themselves. I think the political nature of subsidies is a huge part or like a huge challenge of the above problem. So really to address subsidies, you need strong buy-in from political and senior leadership, and really that lack of confidence in terms of subsidy reform is linked to sense that there's a lack of public support for subsidy reforms. So really to have any kind of strong case for subsidy reforms, it's essential to have politically viable reform strategies with buy-in from affected groups. The next point I want to raise is really the impact of different crises and their impact on subsidies. So I think over the last few years, we've seen obviously the coronavirus as well as the Ukraine-Russia war. And at the start of COVID, so ISD was part of a consortium called the Energy Policy Tracker, which essentially tracked government commitments to the energy sector. And again, what we found was that the moment COVID hit and there was an impact on the economy, governments relied primarily on promoting fossil fuels to actually drive economic growth. So really, there's a need to have good pre-existing plans for clean energy to ensure that when a crisis does hit, it can play an important role in influencing policy. Again, similarly, I think we've seen this in the Ukraine-Russia war. The IEA put out some data on fossil fuel subsidies, and they quantified it at almost $1.1 trillion over the last year. And this excluded producer subsidies. So actually, the scale of subsidies was significantly higher than what even they estimated. And I think what a large part of the subsidies weren't necessarily just in the developing world. So just to give you an example, in the UK and the EU, fossil fuel subsidies were estimated to be about 67 billion in 2021. And a report by Bruegel, which is a think tank based in the EU, found that subsidies or household support rose to almost 700 billion in the EU and the UK alone in 2022, primarily to mitigate some of the impacts of the energy price rise on households. So I don't think we've come up with a good way to address the spike in oil and gas prices and their impact on subsidies as a whole. Just at an international level, I think we have had international agreements on reforming sort of fossil fuel subsidies, but there's often very vague language used, like the reform of inefficient subsidies, which almost creates a loophole. It's not really clear what kind of subsidy is really efficient. So I think what we really need is to define a few clear subsidies, that typically advance energy access. So for example, clean cooking, electricity, and not include or not give this loophole to countries to actually get out of this commitment. And another thing we lack at an international level is a lack of clear timelines to actually phase out a lot of these subsidies. Just maybe two more points from my side. So the first is, we talk about subsidies, but really what we're talking about is government support to the energy sector. And subsidies is just one part of this puzzle. Governments actually influence the energy sector also through PSUs or state-owned enterprises. And a lot of actually their spending influences outcomes in the energy sector. Again, what we found is that a lot of PSUs actually provide a much larger investment support to fossil fuels. And similarly, we can talk about PFI lending, which is public financial institutions, and the lending they provide to fossil fuels and clean energy. So these are your both domestic public financial institutions and international financial institutions. So really, when we talk about reform of subsidies, we're talking about how to reform government support to the energy sector as a whole. Just one final point on India specifically. So I think India has actually done a fairly good job in terms of reforming both diesel and kerosene subsidies. So both of these subsidies have fallen almost 70% from 2014 to 2022. And there's a lot of really good lessons from that, reform that, can be used for other countries. The first is, I think, the importance of a gradual phase out. So typically, the reform took place, prices changed on a monthly basis, which allowed households to absorb the impact of the price rise, and it didn't create a lot of social opposition. And second is just the importance of policy continuity. So I think this shift to a sort of flexible pricing regime started in 2012. And even though there was a change in government in 2014, they actually continued a lot of that process. Because I think what we've found in many countries around the world is there's, eventually a rollback of subsidies in general. So yeah, I think those are some of the main points. I think in terms of just questions, I had one question, which is just on the inflationary impact of some input subsidies. So I think you've talked about, how even though subsidies can be regressive, they can contribute a high share of poor households' sort of expenses. But again, like when we talk about certain types of fuels, like for example, input fuels like natural gas that are used in downstream industries, if you actually remove those subsidies, could it not have an inflationary impact on the wider economy? And is that not a big concern?
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. So I'll now turn to Dr. Gulati. I don't think I need to introduce you to everybody in this room, of course, knows, and many of his team members actually here. And I think a lot of what you have said, Richard, should be resonating well with the team, because this is the issue that has been dialogue. But I want Ashok to talk a little bit, because this is something. This is for economists, it's like no-brainer. Everybody says, but it never happens. And so, some of this political economy stuff from an Indian point of view would also help to bring some discussion that we can get when you get to the Q&A session. So over to you. Can you pass the stage?
Well, thanks, Deepak, and let me start by complimenting you for a very rich, it's a treat to me, music to my ears, the paper and the study that you have done. To me, it is in three compartments. One, the big numbers game on the expenditure is called subsidies, and whether they are the market price support or the budgetary subsidies or any other form. So one is that. The other is the impact of that on the environment. What is happening on land, water, air. And the third part, which I was looking very anxiously, is how to reform. You gave some basic Buddha's principles. I can wait, I can fast, I can think. So I will come to some specifics, but my submission would be, as Deepak said, that amongst our tribe of economists, on the first two parts, there won't be much of a quarrel. And the third part is a hard nut because it goes beyond the economists. It goes into the political economy territory. And I think we need to understand that a little better. And it is with that, two things I'll say. One, submit to you, what are the best practices of those countries who have done something? I think they need to be highlighted so that others are aware of it. Coupling and decoupling questions will be very much in that game. Secondly, in case of India, perhaps, I can give little examples that I have been dealing for not years, but decades, and still not getting through. First, the India case where you showed our overall subsidy in agriculture isn't much because there is a huge negative, the market price support. How it happens, our two biggest crops, for example, rice today is having an export tax of 20%, and wheat exports are banned. And on top of that, because RBI is concerned with lowering inflation, we unloaded, literally dumped wheat, 3.4 million tons. It was costing us 26, 27 rupees, and we dumped it in the open market at 21, 22 rupees to bring the prices down so that we can procure more. So this adds to the negative market price support in OECD's calculations. And they outweigh the positive budgetary support that they give through fertilizer subsidy. Fertilizer subsidy today is about $24 billion. One thing that is not caught in your subsidy estimation, when you say on the consumer front, the output price support, our food subsidy, so-called for the poor, and poor in this country are for food subsidy defined as 2/3 of India. So is that poor? Is that a safety net or a pure dole for votes? And that's another $25 billion. So you have these, but they lock into each other. And I'll give you one micro example on which one of the colleagues here team has been working, how it leads to environmental disaster. Punjab, you must have heard, and hopefully you have visited sometime. It was never meant to be a state growing rice. In 60s, rice area was 0.1 million. Today, it is 3.1 million hectares. They get 25 irrigations. Literally flooding of that. Methane emission. On top of that, 254 kilograms of fertilizers. Out of that, 184 is 187 is nitrogen, nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide. So you have methane, you have nitrous oxide. On top of that, you have stubble burning and machinery, all harvest combines and all that. Per hectare. If you look at how much greenhouse gas emissions you are producing, it's an environmental disaster. But if Punjab was not there, India would have been in tight spot, and how many millions would have if that nitrogen have not given us that, how many people would have died. In the political arena where the policies are made, they are walking on a very tight rope. They have to feed 1.43 billion people today, likely to be 1.6 by 2050. India case I'm talking. So you have to increase, and that's where coupling and decoupling question comes in, because they give something. So fertilizers are started off in late 70s was perhaps the right thing to quickly get the production up. But today, 90% subsidy on urea is causing havoc. 90% subsidy on urea. You know, you have technological solutions. New technologies are there. Nano fertilizer is one, and on Wednesday we are having actually a roundtable on nano fertilizers. And they can easily save your, subsidy bill. They can save you on environment, but the communication and knowledge about the new technologies is becoming a big, difficult job. The political economy is they want to keep on one side the prices of outputs low, so that's where the negative subsidy comes by putting all controls. And then to incentivize the farmers to produce enough so that they can feed the largest population, they give all these subsidies, free power, free or literally highly subsidized urea. So one foot is on the brake and one foot is on the accelerator, and they don't know which side they are there. The result is in Punjab, because of free power and this rice assured procurement, their water table in districts like Sangrur, which is the chief minister's district, has gone down by 25 meters in the last 20 years. 25 meters, it's the environment. So how do we get out of that? Before the last election, we started saying, you give all these subsidies, club them together and give on per hectare basis as aggregate subsidy, somewhat decoupled from this. So it was an attempt to that. Government did listen. Starting with one state government, Telangana, then another state government, Odisha, and then even center came up. But instead of clubbing all these input subsidies into this, which we were recommending, they announced a new income policy of, PM Kisan or Raitu Bandhu or Kalia, whatever names they have given. But those input subsidies have remained intact. There is some internal exercise going on as we talk, some thinking going on, maybe after the elections, something can be done. But I think on the political economy front, it would be a great service if, given your resources and reach around the world, how the developed countries moved from, they also used to do the same, right? But when the income levels go up and they don't need too much production, their populations are stagnant, how much they can eat, right? So they can easily move from coupled subsidies to decoupled as income support. It's an equity question. But in this case, it is issue that we have to protect and we have to keep producing more. And how best to give that thing, and this lady has been working on what is the best way to go about, is agriculture R&D. We worked when my earlier incarnation with IFPRI. What is the marginal rate of return of $1 billion invested in fertilizer subsidy versus agri R&D? And it is 11:1, less than 1 in fertilizers, in power subsidy or in water subsidy, compared to 11 times more if you give it through agri R&D. But that switch that you have to make, because agri R&D will be done by the public sector or organized private sector, whereas this fertilizer subsidy or free power is coming to the farmer. He feels something is there in my hand today. And the first principle of credibility comes into operation. Whatever you are getting today, take that. Tomorrow, no promise. Nobody believes these governments. So on that. So with that, I think my submission once again is to repeat, please give us some concrete examples that we can sell to our political masters. Everybody understands the problem, but they are finding it hard to navigate through the political jungle. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. So very helpful. I think this is exactly where I wanted the discussion to end. I think it's I think solid diagnosis, very good analysis, but then what do you do with in terms of policy and how rich countries manage to phase it out? Is there a threshold where, you know, in terms of food security that you'll reach and after which you feel like you can take some of these risky steps of removing it? And so it will be very good for some international case study and benchmark for Indians to know. But I think I'll give you about 5 minutes to respond to some of this question before we turn to online. I know there are a couple of very knowledgeable people online. Rajkumarji, can you put it on green? And so we'll come to them first online for question and then come to the audience here. So no, there are more people, Rajkumarji, you have still kept them as a participant. I want everybody to be on screen so that they can ask questions. So please.
Okay, let me be very brief because I would love to hear from the participants on the screen and even in the audience here. Professor Gulati, to your point, and Deepak, to your point, I think a very good example to study would actually be Australia, what it did with water, and Australia and New Zealand, what it did with agricultural subsidies. In both cases, it was, you know, like the old-fashioned productivity was subsidized, heavy, inefficient subsidies in both countries. And then there was a kind of a political consensus that it's good for the country not to have this. And especially in the case of Australia, both Australia and New Zealand, call it the Farmers' Party, or the National Party was actually part of the club. And the National Party was also served as being this realism check and in the lead of the reform. And the reform started by compensating farmers, having plenty of discussion, having the states all on board, and a huge pot of money. For the water reforms, it was $10 billion, non-trivial sum of money. That was put on the table, says, if you want to come to the party and have the reform, this money is for you. If you don't want to come, it ain't there. Goodbye, go. And I would submit that amongst, I mean, you know this better than me, but amongst all countries in terms of the subsidy, Australia and New Zealand would stand out in terms of how low the level of support is, despite droughts, et cetera, that actually exist, and open borders for agricultural products. I think that would be one very, very good example, but especially studying the political economy, because especially in Australia, again, you have a federal system where you have to bring the states. And without the states, nothing could have happened. I can talk about that for hours, but I won't. Siddharth, thank you for your very good points. I agree with everything, but your question that you left to me was, so what can we say about the inflationary impact? So yes, we could argue that. And of course, you know, President Biden has something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is designed to bring down the supply price of green technologies. But there are those that argue that the Inflation Reduction Act might actually be inflationary because of everything that it does. And in the same way, I would argue that, just as those people argue, that perhaps you're right, but we have to look at what the counterfactual is. What could I actually do with that money? And is this the best way that I bring down inflation? Maybe it is. If that's my objective, maybe it's not. I would submit that as my first point. My second point, I would go back to an ancient principle in macroeconomics. If I have two objectives, if one objective is, say, increasing food production, and the other objective is inflation, very seldom will a single instrument work for both objectives. Usually it's two objectives, two policy instruments. And I doubt very much, but it could be the case, but I doubt very much that in general, using subsidies to bring down inflation is the most efficient way of controlling inflation. It could be, we could tell a story where all the inflationary pressure comes from energy and nowhere else. Then I think that would be the case. But in other more general cases, where it's interest rates, whatever else, it may not be the case there. So I would, you know, I think we need a little bit of nuance when people throw that at us. Kavita, thank you. Very good point. I think, you know, maybe I didn't emphasize this enough. Nowhere was I talking about getting rid of subsidies, rather it's repurposing them. So if you're going to lose and you're poor, I would rather give you the money exactly as you said, right? As being a kind of farmer, I wouldn't do it per hectare, rather do it per person. The economist's ideal non-distortionary tax is a lump sum subsidy or a tax, right? So as close as we can possibly get, some kind of a welfare payment would be the way that we would go. I think if you don't have a welfare payment to compensate, even for the rich, forget it. And I say that even for the rich because the example of Australia and New Zealand, none of those, sorry, it won't be popular to say this, but none of those farmers are especially poor or poor by any stretch of the imagination. They're some of the wealthiest people in the state and some of the most influential people in the states that live in the country, or at least once they were. And they were compensated heavily, and in fact, overcompensated, many would argue, right, from different political spectrum. But I think if you want the reform, we live in a second best world. We don't live in an ideal world with, I love your, I'm going to use your terminology, Buddha's principles. You know, so Buddha with realism. So that's my 2 cents, but thank you so much. I agree fully.
Okay, now let's turn to folks online. I know Partha is connected. I saw Rajesh Chadha, but I think he's left. Mr. Karthik Bansal. So anybody who wants to ask any question online, please switch on your video or raise your virtual hand. If you have any question, comment, okay. Deepak Maheshwari.
So my question was in terms of what can be done in a country like India in terms of making the subsidies more explicit. As you mentioned that the implicit is explicit part is less and implicit is much more, especially considering, as Dr. Gulati just mentioned, I mean, just the 3 Fs, the food, fertilizer, and the fuel, they account for more than 50% of the subsidy bill in the country. So what can be done just to make these things more transparent? Repurposing is, of course, the second step, but just repurposing.
Okay, good. Anybody else online? Okay, so let's take some more questions. This is Karthik Bansal. Mr. Bansal, you can switch on your camera if you want to, or if not, you can still speak. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Hey, so I had 2-part questions. The first one was to do with how natural resource subsidies work when they are in conflict with certain WTO regulations, in terms that when you are giving natural resource subsidies to domestic enterprises or to further more domestic production of resources, and have certain developing countries face issues with regard to WTO regulations. And secondly, I would like to know if there are currently the second question on a broad framework is if there are any current systems for natural resource subsidies that are being done specifically towards minerals or critical minerals in any country, that could be a framework that we could study further. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, very good. Anybody else? Okay, let's take one question from here and then we can do another round. Anybody in the table? Is there some people are here but left? Yes, please.
I have given a lot of numbers. One is on 17% effect of nitrogen fertilizers from these subsidies and things related to the deforestation. So I just have one quick question. Do you have estimated the amount of GHG emissions which can be linked to the subsidies? So I'd just like to have that.
Can I have half the question?
You have 5.
You know,
You don't have
the
half.
solution I'm looking for, Punjab's rice, for example. You know, the profitability there is very high. If we move to some less water intensive crop or less greenhouse gas emitting crop, can we create a carbon market and can we give that benefit as carbon reward, switching from crop A to crop B? Has any country tried that? Because that's, you know, farmer will not switch away if his income goes down. Simple. So how do we get his income? As you rightly said, they may be the richest people in the country's peasantry, but nobody wants to see their income go down just because environment is getting impacted. So how do you put that extra money on the table so that they switch from rice to pulses to oilseeds to something else which are more nitrogen fixed? You will save on power subsidy, you will save on water, you will save on greenhouse gas emissions, you will save on all these. Can we monetize all these gains and give him that? Has any country tried?
Okay, very good. So 4 questions. So there's one more from Partha, which is about cross-border effects. You mentioned about the Amazon versus this, and how do you attribute to this? In the same line, you know, the global numbers that you showed, is there also country-specific numbers for those for airline, and those are available in the report? Okay.
Good. Okay. So let me start from the beginning. So I agree with Mr. Maheshwari's comment that if we could make the damage and of the subsidies and even the extent of the explicit subsidies more transparent and have it more in discussion, you're more likely to get reform. You look at the examples where reform has been successful, it is only successful when people are on board with you, not when you shove it down their throat. Unless you talk about an autocracy, right? Anything is possible in a strict autocracy. So part of that is really showing people the amount of money that is being wasted going down the drain and that it's hidden. And while it's hidden and not explicit, it's going to always remain thus, right? Because no one knows. And once it's made explicit, you could actually turn around and say, I could actually use that money in ways that A is doing less harm, and also to give you more schools, more hospitals, more whatever. The revenue recycling is absolutely critical to show that there are greater gains from what's happening now, and to actually make sure that it becomes a political win rather than a political loss, as has happened. I mean, I do remember when Deepak was in the World Bank, there was a state government in India that got rid of the energy subsidy to farmers and lost.
Yeah.
That,
No,
remember that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Andhra Pradesh.
Yeah, yeah. You don't want that, right? You want to do it in a way in which you don't pay that price. I think that's really, really important. Mr. Bansal, look, is there subsidies to critical minerals? I'm not aware of any, and if there are, I would resist them. I think it's not necessary. They're profitable enough. In fact, if anything, there should be a, you know, if anything, a tax, because it's rents. I'm talking about rents here in the manner of an economist. Rents are excess earnings over and above what you need to remain in the business. So we get rents, of course, in all resources, natural resources, right, that are tied usually to land or that are finite in supply, almost. So I would not advocate any subsidies for critical minerals. And of course, everything that we see, at least in theory, has to be WTO compliant. Otherwise, you run into problems with the WTO and you can't trade. And the majority, really, big subsidies are WTO compliant. But remember, the WTO has to also be very politically pragmatic, right? There's a limit as to how purist it can actually go. It has to live in a world that's second or third best, and its rules are guided by that. Very good point. We didn't do it. It's obvious. We should have calculated greenhouse gas emissions. Totally. We only did it for fossil fuels. We didn't do it for the others. We really should have done it. Sorry, didn't think of that, but that's something we should actually do. Profitability of rice. First, let me go to the rice question. I'm sure Professor Gulati will agree with me when I say the first thing to do before you do anything is to try to remove the minimum price support for rice and move it to, say, lentil.
Don't want this government to remain in place.
Oh, I would say good. Okay, right. In an ideal world, in the world of Buddha, in Buddha's world, we would remove the minimum price support for rice and we would give it to, say, lentils, which are much healthier for you, nutrient value, do much less damage, are good for the soil because of the nodes of, the nitrogen nodes that you get, et cetera, and other crops such as that. In a second best world, we might have to incentivize that through carbon markets. There's been few experiments, but nothing at scale. Carbon markets remain very, very immature. Until the world can get them going, I think it's going to be pretty difficult, because if you had carbon markets, so much more that you could actually do. Having said that, who knows where it's going? Not quite on rice, but in other things. In the United Kingdom, having left the EU, one of the things that's on the table and that was proposed was to actually get farmers to do the right thing by the environment, so payment for environmental services. So rather than paying them to grow the equivalent of rice there, the payment was to grow hedgerows and proper protection schemes and the right thing. So that is actually around, and you have those sorts of schemes instead of carbon markets. Cross-border effects. How do you calculate them? Very, very good point. So what you can do is that you have actually that bit is easier to do than the actual effects on deforestation. The cross-border effect is, I know that there's an exogenous change, for example, in the subsidy that is paid in the United States for beef. And then I also know how much of the beef, the feed for cattle, is coming from where it's coming from, and I can track that. And I also know where it is actually grown. And it's a very, very simple subroutine that you can write in R, even an idiot like me can do it, that you can actually track that, and a very, very good causal regression that you can get, because you know that the subsidy in the United States is not influenced by the forest cover in the Amazon, right? I mean, it's the two. So if you're seeing a spike in one and going in the other. The other harder, because I've got the floor, but it's the other much harder question to answer is, how do you track what a subsidy on, say, soy generally is doing to deforestation caused by soy? If you just ran that regression, it would be a very stupid thing to do. Why? Because you know what? I deforest, then that's going to change the price of soy, that's going to affect deforestation. I have the circularity in there. So instead, what we do is that you take the top 3 to 5 producers of soy, and you look for exogenous climate shocks like a drought in any of those. You have a drought, supply is going to fall globally, price is going to change globally, purely exogenous shift. And then I can work out what that exogenous shift in soy prices has done to deforestation in soybean growing places. So we get rid of that problem. Then also, if you go to the annex, so even you don't like that, we do a regression discontinuity analysis. And we show that for 2 countries that are growing cocoa. Cocoa is grown in the forest. And we show that the country on the border, right on the border, Côte d'Ivoire versus Ghana. Côte d'Ivoire has much higher subsidies. The deforestation is orders of magnitude higher than it is in Ghana. Everything else remains the same, population, blah, blah, usual RDD that we actually do. We do that for country after country after country. We do have country level estimates, but of course, you know the bank very well. If that was to be made public, you'd have to go through every single CMU, and I would still be seeking clearances. So
Not published.
not published, right?
Okay.
So we have them for India, of course, wherever else.
Okay, very good. I think there's a Siddharth with a question that is the full report published?
So I can send it to you. It's we've got to just jump a few hurdles. But if anyone's interested, you can email me and I'll send it to you. It's just, when I say hurdles, it's just that some big people want to make some speeches to release the report. That's all. We're waiting for that. It's not
Okay.
being taped.
No, no.
Okay.
Even if it is taken, it will not be published. So anybody who is interested could just write to Malay, so that he can be in touch with and send you the copy of the report, but that's only for your eyes until the report is published. I think we are done. I don't want to take another round because I don't think we'll have time, but can I then ask Cecil to briefly, if you want to summarize to something, Cecil is our fellow in Climate Change Urbanization Systems Unit. Yeah. And thank all the people.
Thank you, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody here, all panelists and guests, for sharing their views on the insightful report on distortionary subsidies. Thank you, Dr. Richard, for sparing some time and actually giving a very insightful presentation on these subsidies. I think you've given a lot of food for thought for a lot of people here. Thank you, Dr. Mishra, for encouraging us to organize the sessions and expand our knowledge base continuously. I would also like to thank our the discussants, Dr. Gulati, Dr. Rao, and Mr. Goyal, for sharing your constructive views, feedbacks, as well as insights on the actual issues on the road to paving the sort of repurposing the distortionary subsidies, the practical issues that we can actually see in our country as well as others. And also, I would also like to thank all our discussants, all our audience here as well as online, for being an active audience and for bearing with us throughout the session. And lastly, but definitely not the least, I would like to thank the research team and the admin team for making this seminar a success. Ms. Ritika Verma, Mr. Malik Kotal, Ms. Neha Arora, Mr. Rajesh Chaudhary, and Mr. Rajkumar. Thank you so much, everybody online, and thank you so much here. Everybody here, I would request, please join us for some tea and coffee post the session. Thank you.